Long before the first European ship broke the horizon of the western Atlantic, the American continent was not empty. It was not waiting. It was not silent. As relevant, it was alive with tens of millions of people who had been living on this land for at least 15,000 years, perhaps much longer. They spoke hundreds of languages. They built cities and roads, irrigation systems, cultivated crops that would eventually eat half the world. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, cacao. They traded across thousands of miles. They watched the stars and built calendars of extraordinary precision. They governed themselves through systems ranging from small beans to vast empires, millions and myths and monumental that still astonish visitors today. This is where the story of America begins. Not in Europe, not with a king's charter or a captain's ambition, but here, with the people who already called it home. The great civilizations of the Americas were diverse beyond easy summary. In the Valley of Mexico, empire, properly called a city of on an island in a lake, a metropolis, perhaps 200,000 people at its height, larger than any city in Europe at the time. Its causeways, its floating gardens called chinampas, its great pyramid and Spanish stores encountered it in 1999 with a wonder they struggled to put into words. Far to the south, in the Andes Mountains of what is now Peru, the Inca stretched for thousands of miles along the Pacific coast, connected by a net of roads and relay runners, governed from the mountain capital of Cusco, with administrative sophistication that rolled anything in the old world. In the American Southwest, the ancestors pueblos built that snarly to century for Europeans. Before Europeans arrived, along the Mississippi River, the Mississippian culture had created urban centers. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, may have had a population in the 12th century, surrounded by enormous earthen mounds that still rise from the Illinois flatlands. In the forests of the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, created political unions of 5 nations, governed by principles of consensus and representative council that some historians have argued influenced the framers of the American Constitution. These were not primitive peoples. living in nature. They were human beings with histories as long as complex as those of any civilization on Earth. The story of America's founding properly must begin with our legend of what was already here, and what was lost, often violently, often and with devastating speed, in the collision between the old world and the new, on the morning of October 12th, 1822, a sailor named Rodrigo Triana, standing watch on the Tenta, saw a white sand cliff grenade and cried out the words that would change history. Land, the three ships of Christopher Columbus, the Nina, the Han, Pinta and Maria, Bia, had Santa Maria, had been semi-westward islands for 33 days. Columbus, a Genoese mariners sailing under the flag of the Spanish crown, and to fund his audacious plan to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. He was wrong about the distance, wrong about what he had found, and wrong about where he was for the rest of his life. He died believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia, but he had done something far more consequential. He had established permanent contact between the eastern and hemispheres. For the first time in recorded history, the island Columbus called San Salvador, which island this was is still debated by historians, but it was almost certainly somewhere in the Bahamas. Was inhabited by the Taino, who greeted the arriving strangers with gifts and curiosity. Columbus noted in his journal, gentle, generous, and entirely without weapons of iron. He also noted with a matter-of-factness that reveals the mevlige that 50 men with weapons could subjugate them all and make them do whatever one wished. Within a generation, the Taino of Hispaniola, the island Columbus established as his base, were effectively extinct districts by a duration of European diseases, to which they had immunity, brutal forced labor in gold mines and old mines, outright violence. The population of Hispaniola, estimated at several 100,000 at Huntamt, had fallen a few thousand within 50 years. This catastrophe, replicated across the Americas with varying speed and intensity, was the first and most devastating consequence of Columbus's crossing. Columbus made 4 voyages between Antilles 92 and 504, and the Caribbean islands and the coastlines, and Central North America. He never reached the mainland of North America, the man whose name would become synonymous with the discovery of the territory would become the United States. But the process he set in motion, the eruption of European ambition, European disease, European, and European violence into the Western Hemisphere would define the next five centuries of American history. News of Columbus's voyages spread rapidly across Europe, igniting among the maritime powers for access to the wealth of the new lands. In 1497, John Cabot, another Italian mariner sailing for the English crown, reached the North America, probably Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island, becoming the first European since the Norse voyager Leif Erikson, 5 centuries earlier, to set foot on the North American mainland. The Norse had established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland around 1000. But it was short-lived, had no lasting impact. Cabot's voyage, contrast by established claim to the North American continent, and began the long process that would eventually produce the English colonies from which the United States would emerge. Early 16th century saw Spanish explorers pushing steadily into the continent. In 1530, Juan Bons became the Gionte Yolern, which he named La Florid, the flowered land, for the lush vegetation he encountered there. In 1519, and then find tween and 20 and Huncan Cortes conquered the Aztec Empire with a combination of military alliances with peoples who resist Aztec domination, and above all the devastating diseases, smallpox, particularly smallpox. In 1539 and 1540, and Hernando de Soto de Soto et Toto blew through the American Southeast. The first European to cross the Mississippi River, Francisco Vasquez, in the same period. Exploded. Abdel submerged west of the Lawrence cities of gold, reaching as far as present-day Kansas. Turning back empty-handed, these expeditions left trail of violence and disease, but no permanent settlements. In what would become the United States, the Spanish established their settlement at St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. 42 years 42 years before the English would found Jamestown, and 55 years before the pilgrims landed came England, came late to the colonial enterprise, while Spain was building a vast empire in the Americas, enormous quantities of gold and silver from Mexico and Peru. England was preoccupied with its own internal upheavals. The break with Rome under Henry VIII, the religious turbulence of the mid-16th century, the long reign of Elizabeth I, and her complex relationship with the Spanish Empire, English interest in North America, largely by privateers like Francis Drake, who raided Spanish shipping in the Caribbean, and by visionaries like Richard Hakluyt, a geographer and propagandist who argued passionately that England needed colonies in the New World to balance Spanish power, provide new markets, as in us the first central English cities. The first serious English attempt at North American colonization ended in one of history's most enduring mysteries. In 1587, a group of 117 colonists, including women and children, land on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, under the leadership of John White. White returned to England supplies, but break of war with Spain, Arimes Armagui of 1588 delayed his return 3 years. When he came back in 1590, the colony had vanished. The only clue was the word Croton carved on a post. The name friendly Native American people. What happened to the lost colony? Colony of Roanoke has not been established, though the most explanation, supported by archaeological and geological evidence, is that the colonists integrated with the Croatoan people. The mystery captured the imagination and never released it. The lesson of Roanoke was clear. Successful colonization required commitment and adequate support from home. The Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company, an early of a corporation in which investors pooled their money and shared both the risks and the profits. Applied this lesson when it organized the expedition that established permanent English settlement in North America in December of 1666. Ships, the Susan's Tent, the Godspeed, and the Discovery set sail from England carrying 100 men and boys. In May 1607, the internet, they are say up a river. They named the James in honor of King James I. On low marshy peninsula they chose for its defensibility. They called Jamestown. The choice of site was militarily sound, but ecologically catastrophic. Jamestown was surrounded by brackish, disease-ridden water. Terraria thrived in the swampy ground. Fresh water was scarce. The colonists themselves were ill-prepared for what awaited them. Many were gentlemen, men of higher social status. They had come expecting to find and to trade with cooperative natives, to build a functioning agricultural community in an unfamiliar environment. Of the 105 original colonists, 2 dead within the first year, killed by disease, starvation, and skirmishes with the Powhatan Confederacy, the powerful alliance of Algonquian-speaking peoples who dominated the region under their paramount chief, Wahonsenaka, known to the English as Powhatan. The survival of Jamestown in those early years owed much to a single man. Smith, a soldier of fortune, a survivor, and an effective leader in a crisis. He imposed the military discipline on the dying colony, established trade relations with the Powhatan, and issued the famous dictum, though it was more complex than the phrase suggests. Those who did not work would not eat. He also recorded his famous encounter with Pocahontas, the daughter of Wahonsenaka, who, according to accounts, saved his life when he was captured by the Powhatan. The story of Pocahontas has been so thoroughly romanticized in popular culture that it is difficult to recover historic reality. She was likely about 10 or 11 years old at the time of Smith's capture. The encounter may have been a formal adoption ceremony rather than a rescue, and the relationship between the English and the Powhatan was primarily one of mutual wariness, periodic violence, and uneasy trade. Smith was injured in a gunpowder accident in 609 and 609 and returned to England, and his departure precipitated what the colonists called the starving time, the winter of 1609 to 1610, during which the population of Jamestown fell from about 500 to about 60. Survivors later reported resorting to cannibalism. Coast Guard in 2012 has confirmed that at least individual that in a bedal, a girl of about 14 now known as Jane, was consumed by her desperate fellow colonists. Jamestown very nearly perished in that terrible winter. Its survival came almost by accident. Relief arrived just as the survivors had loaded their belongings to abandon the settlement. What saved Jamestown in the long run was not gold. There was no gold, but tobacco. In 1612, a colonist named John Rolfe began experimenting with varieties of tobacco, and eventually a strain that appealed bathed. Tobacco became the cash crop that made Virginia economically viable. It also shaped Virginia society in ways that would have profound consequences. Tobacco cultivation is extraordinarily labor-intensive, creating an insatiable demand for workers. This demand would first be met by indentured servants, men and women who sold their labor for a fixed time of years. In America, and eventually, increasingly, Africans. The first Africans arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, in 1619. Brought by an English privateer who had seized them from a Portuguese slave ship. Their legal status in those early years was ambiguous. Some of these early African arrivals completed terms of service and obtained land of their own, but the legal institution of chattel slavery, permanent, hereditary, race-based enslavement, was codified in Virginia law by the 16C law by the ESTs, and would become the defining and ultimately the most destructive institution in American history. While Virginia, as a tobacco colony in the Chesapeake, a very different kind of English settlement was taking shape to the north. In September 1620, a ship called the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, carrying hundreds of passengers. About half of members of a separatist congregation who had broken completely from the Church of England and sought a place where they could practice there freely, and half of them what the separatists ordinary colonists recruited by the Virginia Company to make the venture economically viable. After 66 days at sea, in conditions of extraordinary hardship. The ship was small, the weather brutal, and one passenger died during the Mayflower arrived off the coast of Cape Cod, well north of the Virginia territory. for which they had a patent. Before going ashore, the separatist leaders, later known to history as the Pilgrims, a term they did not use themselves, recognized that landing outside bounds of their legal authority might dissolve the social compact that held the group together. Some of the strangers had reportedly threatened to go their own way once they were ashore, since they were outside any legal jurisdiction. In response, the leaders of the group drafted and had signed what became known as the Mayflower Compact, a brief document in which the signatories agreed to form a civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws, and to submit to those laws for the general good of the colony. 40 adult male passengers signed. It's not a democratic constitution in the modern sense. Women did not sign, servants did not sign, and the strangers signed under some social pressure, but it was a significant early expression idea that government derives from the consent of the governed. It has been celebrated since as a foundation in itself. It's self-governance. The Pilgrims came ashore at what they called Plymouth after their English port of departure, December 1620. The winter was brutal, and by spring nearly half of the colonists had died of cold, the disease, and malnutrition. The survival of Plymouth colony, an enormous and under-acknowledged debt to 2 Native Americans. Who's the colonist? Stalinists by walking into their settlement and they're greeting them in English. He had learned it from English fishermen, and Tisquantum, known as Squanto, a Patuxent man who had been kidnapped by English slavers years earlier, had lived in England and had returned to find his entire village dead of disease. Squanto served as interpreter, taught the Pilgrims techniques of Native American agriculture, including how to plant corn and how to fertilize it with fish. The first Thanksgiving, a 3-day harvest festival in the autumn of 1621, attended by about 50 surviving colonists and none 91 Panmung under the leadership of the Sachem Massasoit, was a genuine expression of gratitude for survival and an authentic, if historically complicated, moment of cross-cultural exchange. The idealized version of this event that has become central to American identity papers. The structuring of American life and culture that was already well underway, a decade after the Pilgrims arrived, a much larger and better funded wave of Puritan migration began transforming New England. The Puritans were not separatists. They did not wish to leave the Church of England to purify it from within, facing increasing persecution under King I. They obtained royal charters at Bay Company, and in 1630, and in 16 and launched a great migration that would bring 20,000 people to New England. Over the next decade, their leader, John Winthrop, articulated their mission in a sermon aboard the flagship before Bella. They were to be, he said, a city upon a hill, a model Christian commonwealth whose success or failure would be watched by the world. This phrase, drawn from the Sermon on the Mount, entered the deepest layers of American consciousness, invoked by presidents from John Kennedy to Ronald Reagan, as an expression of America's special destiny and its sense of itself. An example, humanity. The Puritan settlement of Massachusetts was more stable and more quickly successful than Virginia had been, in part because the Puritans came in families, because they were better supplied and organized, and in part because the Native American population of New England had devastated by an epidemic, probably a combination of diseases in plague, in smallpox, and species 16 and species 19 and 2019, just before the English arrived. This epidemic had killed perhaps 90% of the coastal Algonquian population in some areas, emptying villages that the English then settled, clearing land that the English then farmed, and creating a power vacuum that made European expansion far easier than it otherwise have been. The Puritans, observing the cleared land and the absence of the people cleared it, interpreted the angels. God preparing the land for his chosen people. The Native Americans who survived did not share this interpretation. The Puritan colonies of New England developed distinctive institutions that would leave a lasting mark on American culture. The town meeting, in which all adult male church members gathered to discuss and vote on community matters, was an early form direct democracy. The founding of Harvard College in 1636, just years after the first settlers arrived, for the debut to the Puritan monastery. Literacy and learning. the establishment of the first public school system, mandated by Massachusetts, based the colonies of Delude Satan of 1647, which required towns of a certain size so as to establish schools, so that children could read the Bible and defeat the designs of the old deluder created in educational tradition that in the American public system. To this day, the Puritan emphasis on covenant, on the idea that both individuals and communities enter into binding agreement and God and with each other, contributed to an American legal and political culture in which contracts, charters, and constitutions were invested with extraordinary moral weight. Between the founding of Jamestown in 1607 and the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, England, which became Great Britain after the union with Scotland in 1777 and 1777 in Scotland, established 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. These colonies were not a uniform entity. They differed in their origins, their economies, their social structures, their religious cultures, and their relationships with both the Native American peoples and with the English crown. Understanding their diverse is essential to understanding the event and the benediction of them. From them, the southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, shared a plantation economy based on the cultivation, rices, and indigo, all crops that were enormously profitable, but required intensive labor. This labor was provided increasingly, and then overwhelmingly, by enslaved Africans. By the time of the American Revolution, the enslaved people constituted roughly 40% of the population of Virginia and nearly 60% of the population of South Carolina. The institution of slavery was not a peripheral feature of self-colonial society. It was its economic foundation, its social organizing principle, and its most profound moral contradiction. The men who would later speak most eloquently about liberty and the rights of man, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, were slaveholders who understood at some level the devastating inconsistency between their ideals and their practice, and who nonetheless perpetuated and in some cases expanded that practice throughout their lives. Maryland, founded in 1632 by Catholic Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, as who faced discrimination and protection at home. Maryland's Toleration Act of 1649, which guaranteed was one of the earliest expressions of religious tolerance in the English colonies. Though it also prescribed death for those who divinity of Christ, revealing the limits of 17th century tolerance. Georgia, the last of the colonies to be established, was founded in 1733 by James Oglethorpe with the unusual intention of providing a fresh start for debtors and the poor. Oglethorpe initially banned slavery in Georgia. Those prohibition was eventually returned under pressure from neighboring South Carolina planters. Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were the most ethnically and religiously diverse of the 13. New York had originally been the colony of New Netherland by Bund Adia and centered on the settlement Amsterdam, the southern tip of Manhattan Island. The Dutch colony was deliberately cosmopolitan. Before the Countess of Napoleon, French visitor in 1644, reported hearing in and around New Amsterdam in 1664, appeared in the harbor and demanded surrender. Dutch Governor Peter Stuyvesant, irascible, peg-legged, and deeply unpopular with his own colonists, found no support for resistance and surrendered without a shot. New Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York, the future King James II. Pennsylvania was founded in 1681 by William, a Quaker, member of the Society of Friends, a Protestant sect that rejected formal clergy, ritual, and violence, and that treated women equals of men. Penn received the colony as a land grant from King Charles in repayment of a debt owed to Penn's father, and he conceived it as a holy experiment, a colony governed by Quaker principles, peace, equality, and religious freedom. Penn negotiated honestly with the Lenape and other Native American peoples for land, paying prices and respecting indigenous rights more seriously than virtually any other colonial proprietor. He offered religious freedom to all who believed in God, attracting not only English Quakers, but Mennonites, Amish, Lutherans, and Reformed Protestants who would form the core of what came to be called the Pennsylvania Dutch. Actually, Pennsylvania, meaning German, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Penn named it. Grew rapidly into the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the most colonies in the English colonies and colonies, and Pennsylvania became known as the best poor man's country in the world for the economic opportunities it offered to ordinary settlers. The New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island shared New Hampshire. Puritan religious heritage developed in notably different directions. Rhode Island was founded in 1736 by Roger Williams. A minister had been banished from Massachusetts Bay for his radical views, including the then shocking idea that the civil government had no authority over religious matters, that the colonists had no right to Native American land without purchasing it, and that the Church of England, despite its corruptions, remained a true church. Williams established Providence as a community by the principle of soul liberty. The freedom of each individual to follow his or own conscience in matters of a religion. Rhode Island became a refuge for those who found Massachusetts too restrictive, including Anne Hutchinson, a remarkable woman, challenged the authority of the Puritan clergy by holding religious meetings in her home and teaching theological positions that many ministers threatening. She was tried for sedition and banished from Massachusetts as insane CC 37. But the earliest American occurring national drama, the conflict between community standards and individual conscience. Colonial life for ordinary people, shaped at last then by the immediate demands of survival and daily work. The colonial economy was primarily agricultural. Vast majority of colonists were farmers who grew food for their families, and perhaps a small surplus for sale. Life expectancy was higher than in England, particularly in New England, where the climate was less hospitable. Virginia's early settlers. Colonial families were large by modern standards. It was not for an unusual or 10 children for the course her childbearing years. Though infant and child mortality, many these children did not survive to adulthood. The colonial household was a unit of economic production as well as family life. Women spun, wove, preserved, food, made candles and soap, tended kitchen gardens, and in some cases accounts and managed businesses. The line between domestic work and productive labor was sensitive Sicily non-existent. The history of the English colonies cannot be told them without sustained attention to American people. Who shared, contested, and were progressively dispossessed of the land the colonists done. Settling. This is not a simple story of innocent victims and ruthless aggressors. Though dispossession and violence are undeniable facts, it is a story of complex relationships, trade, alliance, intermarriage, diplomacy, conflict played out across an enormous continent over more than a century and a half. In the early decades of colonization, Native American peoples were not passive recipients of European expansion. They were active agents who made strategic choices about how to engage with the newcomers, recognizing the opportunities and threats Europe presented. Native Americans traded eagerly for European metal tools, which were more stone implements and fingerlets and they formed alliances with competing European powers. French, Dutch, Spanish, to gain advantage over indigenous rivals. They negotiated, threatened, and sometimes submitted to European authority. When submission seemed the wisest course, the Powhatan Confederacy that dominated Virginia at the time of English settlement was itself an expanding polity, having dozens of smaller groups. Their groups through a combination of military pressure and diplomacy. Wahansanaka saw the English as potentially usefully subordinates or allies, not as an existential threat. The relationship between the English and the Powhatan territory steadily after Wahansanaka murdered Sinaka, his successor Opechicanos, chose some wife Pocahontas. In 1622, Opichenko launched a coordinated attack on English settlements throughout Virginia, killing about 350 settlers, roughly a quarter of the English colonial population. In a single morning. The English response was devastating. Declared permanent war on the Powhatan, destroyed Croyd and villages, pushed Native Americans steadily to Tibet's settlements. A second Powhatan uprising in 1644, led by the now elderly Eldernov Inkenkinov, killed about have about 500 English settlers, the chief's capture and murder in captivity. The Treaty of 1646 established a boundary between England and Anatolish Powhatan territory. At a formal separation of native and colonials, but it was ephemeral. English settlement continued expanding regardless of boundaries. In New England, the most devastating conflict of the 17th century was King Philip's War. Fought between 1775 once a 1776 and 1776. King Philip was the English name given to Metacom Wampatam, Sachem of the Wampanoag, and son Masasmas, the same Massasoit who'd welcomed the Pilgrims in Castellglen in 1621, in the half-century since his father's welcoming gesture. And English welcoming only spilling me by extending excellements, then the traditionally in the Montpellier and ambulatory. And the Wampanoag been pushed into an insubordination alienated with the colonists. Metacom, a broad alliance of Native American peoples, launched a war aimed at driving the New England altogether. For more than a year, it seemed he might succeed. Attacked and destroyed or damaged more than half of the 90 English towns in New England, killed roughly 600 English soldiers, and perhaps another 1,000 civilians, and colonial enterprise in New England to the verge of collapse. The war was eventually turned by a combination of English military adaptation, including and Pequot, and the devastating impact of disease and starvation on Metacom's forces. Metacom was captured in August 1776, and beheaded. His head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. King Philip's War was, proportionally, the deadliest war in American roughly when the English colonial population of New England was killed, and the Native American population of southern New England, effectively shattered. The patterns established in Virginia and New England repeated themselves, with local variations across the continent as English settlement expanded. Disease consistently preceded or accompanied European expansion, killing Native American populations at catastrophic rates, and weakening resistance. Trade relationships created dependencies that eroded Native American independence. Missionary activity conducted by both Catholic and Protestant missionaries with varying degrees of coercion disrupted Native American culture and religious life. Legal instruments, including treaties and land purchase agreements, used transfer Native American land to European owners. In transactions, the Native Americans often did not understand in the same terms as the Europeans, who brought with them a concept of absolute private property ownership that had equivalent in most Native American legal traditions. By the middle of the 18th century, the eastern seaboard of North America was in English hand, but the interior of the continent remained contested. France had established a colonial empire, then territorial dwarfed the English colonies. New France stretched from the St. Lawrence River valleys through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, an enormous arc of territory that enclosed the English colonies on the west and threatened to limit their expansion indefinitely. French colonial strategy was fundamentally different from the English approach. Rather than establishing dense agricultures, a network of trading posts and then missions maintained much better relations with Native American peoples. Through the trade, in which Native Americans were essential parts, and had population and perhaps 70,000 French colonists, more than one English colonists. But French territory was vast. French alliances with Native American peoples were extensive, and French military fortifications controlled the key water routes of the interior. The collision between French sharing missions came to a head in the Ohio River Valley, really in 1750s. Both France and claimed the region, and both were recruiting American allies. In 1754, a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington, 22 years old, 10 years old, ambitious, and inexperienced, led a small force into the Ohio country on behalf of Virginia's colonial government and attacked a French scouting party, killing 10 men, including the French commander, the Sieur Joinville. This skirmish, small in itself, was one of the opening shots of a conflict that would become global. What would Americans the French call French and Indian War, and Europeans call the 7 Years' War, fought between 1754 and 1754 and 1764, and 1763 on 4 continents and 2 lands and 2 oceans, and involving and most of the major powers of Europe. Washington's subsequent actions in years less successful. He was forced to surrender his hastily constructed innocence. But the war eventually went dramatically in Britain's favor. The Prime Minister, William Pitt, committed Britain a strategy of aggressive global warfare, pouring money and troops into North America. General James Wolfe's capture of Quebec had this fleeing note in 79 in battle in which both he and mates de Marquillon were mortally wounded. Broke the wounded, a French power in Canada, when the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in Zundun in 1763. France virtually all of its North America territory in Spain, drawing entirely from the continent east of the Mississippi. That the consequences of Britain's victory were profound and paradoxical. Britain now controlled an enormous empire in North America, but the cost of winning and then governing had been staggering. The national debt had nearly doubled during the war, and the elimination of the French threat, which had been the primary reason the American colonists valued their ambition with Britain paradoxically weakened the bonds of the Bonds Empire. The colonists no longer needed military protection quite as urgently. The stage was set for the crisis that was the American Revolution. The decade between the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, at conflict at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 was of the most inconsequential in American history. It was a decade in which a series of British policy decisions, each defensible on its own terms, combined to produce a crisis of imperial authority that neither side had sought or could control. Britain's first response to its poor situation was the submission in 1763, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The purpose was to reduce the cost and complexity with Native American people by keeping colonists out of contested interior. The effect was to infuriate land-hungry colonists and speculators, including himself, who had been counting on Western land grants as part of his compensation for military service, who saw the proclamation as an arbitrary restriction on their opportunities. The proclamation was ignored. Then came the taxes. In 1764, Parliament, the Sugar Act, which imposed duties on imported molasses and other goods, crucially, established as new mechanisms for enforcement that threatened the extensive smuggling networks on which the New England merchant economy had long depended. In 1765 came the Stamp Act, which required colonists to pay a tax on all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, even playing cards. By purchasing specially stamped paper. This was the first direct tax Parliament had ever imposed colonies. And an explosion that took false as well as highs the colonists. The colonists' objection was not primarily about the money. The sums involved were relatively modest. It was a constitutional objection. Parliament no right to tax them because they had no representatives. Parliament. Taxation without representation was tyranny. The principle that Englishmen could only be taxed by their elected representatives was, the colonists argued, a fundamental right by English liberty, carried by Magna Carta, and the constitutional traditions stretching back centuries. The rallying cry of taxation without representation are principle that was simultaneously wielded England. It appealed English constitutional tradition and forward-looking, pointing toward a new theory of a sovereignty. Opposition to the Stamp Act took both intellectual and physical forms. Customs. Colonialists passed a benign parliament's authority and taxed them. A Stamp Act Congress, attended by delegates from 9 colonies, met in New York and issued colonial rights. On the streets of New York, other cities, organizations, coalitions calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized boycotts and intimidated, sometimes violently, the tax collectors appointed to enforce the act. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to the colonies in all cases, while cases whatsoever. A saying gesture that solved nothing and stored up trouble for the future. Parliament's next attempt at colonial taxation, the Town Acts, the Intend Acts of 1767, which imposed duties on imported paper, glass, paint, and tea, produced another wave of opposition, including organized boycotts of British goods in which wind in which women played a crucial role, spinning their own cloth rather than purchasing British imports, and publicly branding as enemies of liberty. The boycotts. The Townshend duties were eventually repealed, except for the tax on tea, which Parliament retained as a symbolic assertion of its right to tax the colonies. In Boston, the tensions between colonists and British authority produced a tragedy that became a rallying point. Resistance. On the evening of March 1717, a crowd of Bostonians, angry, provocative, and doing ice, confronted a small group of British soldiers outside the customs house. In the chaos that followed, the soldiers fired Kiang, including Crispus Amalx, a man of African and Native American descent, who became celebrated as the first martyr of the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as colonial propagandists immediately called it. The soldiers were actually tried and most were acquitted, with John Adams, the future president, serving as their defense attorney in an act of civic courage, was a turning point in colonial consciousness. A moment when the abstract over constitutional rights. The final crisis before open conflict began with tea. The Tea Act of 1773 by Parliament to rescue the financial British in the and tea. The price of tea in the colonies gave the company a monopoly that it threatened undercut monarchical merchants, and the tax on tea remained, keeping the constitutional issue alive. On the night of December 16, 1773, discolonists, Mohawk Indians, East India Company ships in harbor, and dumped 342 chest tea, worth about 10,000 pounds, roughly $1 million in modern terms, into the water. The Boston Tea Party was in disbelieved theater, and it forced a response from Parliament, proved draw for the imperial relationship. Parliament's response. The Cour Save Vax 1774. Colonists called intolerable acts. Closed Boston Harbor until the tea paid for, until the tour curtailed the powers of Massachusetts self-government, required colonists to house British soldiers, and extended the reach of British authority in ways that alarmed even colonists whom sympathized more radical radiators. agitators, instead of isolating Massachusetts and punishing it into submission, the coercive acts united the colonies in opposition. The First Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in September 1774, together delegates from the 12 of the Georgia did it, who agreed to a comprehensive boycott of British goods and affirmed the colonists' rights, self-governance. By the spring of 1775, possibility conflict. On the night of April 18th, 1775, British General Thomas Gage, a column of 700 regulars out of Boston to seize of colonial arms stored at Concords, Massachusetts, and if possible, to arrest the rest of radical leaders Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. Paul Revere, a silversmith and active member of the Sons of Liberty, that had by the time the British column reached Lexington, dawn on under the group about 70 colonial militiamen stood on the town green. It has never been determined who fired the shot. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the shot heard round the world. When the shooting was over, 8 militiamen were dead, and 1 British soldier had been wounded. The British column marched on to Concord, found most of the arms already moved, and began march back to Boston. All the way back, colonial militiamen fired on them behind stone walls, trees, and farmhouses. By the end of the day, 70 British soldiers, 100 more, were wounded. The American Revolution had begun. The Continental Congress, meeting a king in Philadelphia in May 1777, took command of the militia forces in Boston, and appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. The choice was partly military and partly political. Washington had the most distinguished military career of any American-born officer. But he was also a Virginian, and choosing Virginian to command what had so far been largely a New England army helped cement the unity of the colonies in their common cause. The road from the first shots at Lexington to the Declaration of Independence was shorter than it might have been. For most of 1775, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They were frightened. They were fighting. They told themselves, not for independence, but for their rights as English subjects. What changed minds with extraordinary speed was published in January 1776, by a recent English immigrant named Thomas Paine. Common Sense was written in plain language to ordinary readers, and it may made the case for independence with Americanus, eminence, and force that the Dolingan might call them the Livolino Partive. Political writing. Paine argued that monarchy itself was an absurd institution, that hereditary rule was a relic of barbarism, and that the time had come for America to declare itself a self-free and independent republic. Common Sense sold approximately 500,000 copies in these perhaps 2.5 million people. Proportionally one of the best-selling political pamphlets in American history. And it moved public opinion with remarkable speed. By the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress that independence was the only viable course was appointed to draft a declaration. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson, the primary drafting fellow. A 33-year-old Virginia lawyer and planter of extraordinary literary gifts, who produced in a few days a document that remains one of the masterpieces in the English language. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, 1776, the things simultaneously. The colonists, the specific grievances against King George III, framing independence as a justified response to a long train of abuses, and it articulated a universal philosophy of human rights in its most celebrated. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These words, aspirational, revolutionary, and burdened with a devastating since himself enslaved than 600 people over the course of his lifetime, have echoed through American history ever since, simultaneously inspiring those who invoke them to demand the expansion of equality and condemning those who blame them while denying their implications. The war itself was long, brutal, and at many points Washington's Continental Army was chronically short of men, weapons, food, clothing, and money. The British, the most powerful military in the world, backed by the resources of an empire, the early years of the war were a near continuous series of American defeats. The British took New York, and New York in 1776, forcing Washington into desperate retreat across New Jersey that nearly ended the Continental Army's existence. Washington's crossing of the Delaware River on the night of December 75, 1776, and the surprise victory at Trenton the next morning. In Emmanuel Lowell's pains, restored some hope and some momentum, but the war remained far from won. The turning point came at Saratoga in October 1777, where forces under General Horatio Gates defeated and captured 6,000 men under General John Burgoyne. Saratoga was the victory that convinced France, which had been watching the American Rebellion with great interest and providing covert assistance, to the war openly as an American ally. French military and financial assistance would prove decisive. Helped pay the Continental Army. French naval power challenged British control of the seas, and eventually a French army alongside Washington's forces in the war's climactic campaign. Valley Forge, the Continental Army's winter encampment from December 1777 to June 1778 to June 78, an iconic symbol of the Revolution's darkest hours. Ends. In the hills of Pennsylvania, 12,000 soldiers endured bitter cold with inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. Roughly 2,000 died of disease and exposure that winter. But Valley Forge was also the Prussian drill master Friedrich von Steuben, a volunteer officer who had once under Frederick the Great, transformed the Continental Army through intensive drilling to a professional fighting force that could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in the spring, it was a different military force than the one that had trudged in. The war's final campaign was fought in Kinyon 781. British General Charles Cornwallis had his army at Yorktown on the Virginia, awaiting reinforcement by the Royal Navy. Washington and the French General Barrow made a bold decision. As British expected, they marched their armies southward to Virginia, while a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting Cornwallis off from relief by sea, surrounded by American and French forces on land, and bland by the French fleet at sea. Cornwallis surrendered his army of 8,000 men on October 19, 1781, when the British banned as the soldiers to lay down their chores. They reportedly showed the world turned upside down. The greatest empire in the world had been defeated by a collection of colonies that 8 years before had not existed as a nation. Victory in war is not the same as a creation of functioning nation. The Articles of Confederation, under which the 13 states loosely cooperated during the Revolution, had created weeks so weak as to be almost non-functional. It could not levy taxes, could not regulate commerce, could not enforce its own decisions, and depended entirely on the voluntary cooperation. By the mid-1780s, the inadequacy of the Articles was painfully the federal government could not pay its debts, including the debts owed to the soldiers who had won the war. Commerce between the states was hampered by regulations and competing currencies. In 1787, an rebellion of Denton farmers in western Massachusetts closed courthouses to prevent the foreclosure of their farms, demonstrated both the social straining in the Republic and the inability of the federal government to respond effectively to internal disorder. In May 1787, 55 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island, refused, gathered in Philadelphia in the sweltering summer heat, with a mandate to revoke days of Confederation. They quickly decided that revision was not enough, and that an entirely new constitution was needed. Conducted in Frankfurt, produced over 4 months one of the most remarkable documents in political history. The delegates were not idealists operating in a vacuum. They were practical men of affairs, lawyers, planters, searchers, soldiers, who brought to their patients both a sophisticated knowledge of political theory and an acute awareness of political realities, interests they had to accommodate. The constitution they produced was a series of compromises. Some of them some of them abnormal, some of them deeply troubling. The Great Compromise resolved the conflict between large and small states by creating a bicameral legislature. A Senate with representation for each state, and a House of Representative apportioned by population. The Electoral College was a compromise between the president chosen by and those who elect popular election. The 3/5 compromise, one of the most morally repugnant provisions in the document, counted each enslaved person as 3/5 and 3/5 for purposes of congressional apportionment, giving the southern states more representatives than their population would have justified, and embedding the institution of slavery of the new the Constitution created a federal government of 3 branches, and with carefully divided and balanced against each other. It established the principle of judicial review, the power of courts to strike down legislation that violates the Constitution. The Senate was not made fully explicit, and Chief Marshal in the landmark case Marbury v. Marbury 3 in 803, it protected individual rights against federal government action, though the Bill of Amendments, 10 amendments proposed by James Madison and ratified in 1791 was necessary to address the widespread concern that the original document gave too much power to the federal government without sufficient protection for individuals. Ratification of the Constitution required by 9 of the 13 states. It was a close-run thing in several of the most important states. The debate between Federalists who supported ratification and anti-Federalists the concentration of federal government was the most intellectually rich political debates in American history. The Federalist Papers 85 by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John J. Panjay under the pseudonym Publius, and published in New York newspapers in 1707 in 1788, remain the most authoritative commentary on the Constitution's meaning, and one of the great works of American political thought. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States in 1789. The only president in history received the unanimous support of the Electoral College. He was inaugurated in New York, then the nation's capital, on April 30th, in 799, taking the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall, and adding by tradition, if not by requirement, the words, "So help me God." Washington understood that everything setting precedents for those who would follow him. And he acted with a consciousness as his full. Theatrical. His decision to step down after 2 terms. In effect, the offer of a presidency for life had suggested was perhaps most important democracy, establishing the norm of peaceful transition of power that, with significant exception, has held for more than 2 centuries. The America that emerged from its revolutionary birth was paradox, wrapped in an aspiration. It was a nation founded on the most radical egalitarian principles ever written political document. All men are created equal, uncreated equal, endowed with inalienable rights, by men who enslaved other human beings, dispossessed indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, and excluded women from political participation entirely. It was a nation proclaimed liberty as founding value, while constructing and of its population. It was a nation of astonishing diversity in language, religion, ethnicity, and culture, that nonetheless harbored deep anxieties about truly belonged. These contradictions were not hidden, and then the men who founded the nation were acutely aware of them. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration's soaring affirmation equality, also wrote about slavery that trembled for his country when God is just. John Adams worried that the republic they had created might not spend internal tensions. James Madison, the conscience principle architect, understood the document's compromises on slavery, himself. They were right. The resolution came in the most terrible way imaginable. A civil war that killed more Americans than all the country's other wars combined. But the promise was also real. The principles articulated in the Declaration and protected by the Constitution created a framework within which the excluded could demand inclusion. Within which the definition of who counted as fully human could be expanded, within which the gap between aspiring and reality could be named, contested, and slowly, very slowly, narrowed. Every great expansion of American freedom, the constitutional amendments of amendment, Reconstruction, the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, the civil movement, the civil rights movement, has invoked the founding promise and demanded that the nation live up to its own professed values. In this sense, the founding generation bequeathed austerity not a finished achievement, but an ongoing argument. An argument about what America is, what it should be, and who it is for. The land that became the United States of America was ancient before European eyes first saw it. It was populated peoples of extraordinary day and sophistication. It was transformed, often violently and at enormous human cost, by the collision erosion and indigenous us, whereas by the forced labor enslaved Africans, by the faith and the determination of countless ordinary men and women who came seeking something better. The nation that emerged from this collision was imperfect, contradictory, and from the beginning in its ideals and its realities. That struggle continues. It is, in the deepest sense, what America is, a destination arrived at, a journey still underway toward perfect union that the Constitution itself acknowledges has not yet been achieved.